Alex Carter was 29 years old, and his routine as a biologist specializing in remote ecosystems often took him to isolated areas of southwestern Colorado near the Bloody Mountains. His work involved studying endangered species and monitoring wildlife, but it also led him to temporarily live in small camps within the wild, far from any civilization. He was an introspective person, resistant to loneliness, and with a curiosity that often led him to explore limits that most others avoided. Their work camp, an ancient forest known to locals as the Valley of the Spirits, had had a reputation for mystery for generations, carrying stories of indigenous legends about creatures that straddle the line between the natural and the supernatural. The region was covered with tall, thick trees, their canopies forming an almost permanent shadow that enveloped the territory. On a specific night, Alex had received a tip from a surveillance team that something strange was occurring in the most remote part of the forest. Monitoring devices had captured unusual sounds and unexplained movements, which seemed to defy natural logic. From that moment on, his environment became even more suspenseful. The dense mist spread among the trunks, and the silence was broken only by occasional sounds that seemed somehow not to belong to those trees. A sensation of eyes that could not be seen seemed to be watching him, even as he tried to rationalize the atmosphere. In addition to the trees, there was a scarcity of trails or signs of human presence, revealing the absolute isolation of the site. That night, as he set up camp, a sense of unease began to grow. A distant sound, like an almost inaudible whisper, began to invade his ears, coming from deep in the forest. It was as if someone, or something, was trying to get his attention, but in a way he couldn't fully understand. The wind carried a vibration, a type of vibration that seemed to not belong to the natural environment. Some trees seemed to move, though there wasn't enough wind to justify it, and a sense of abandonment merged with his growing anxiety. Alex tried to divide his attention between setting up camp and listening intently, but a sense that he was being watched came over him. Then, suddenly, a low, guttural sound pierced the silence, coming from an area where the vegetation was denser. His instincts warned him of an invisible and at the same time apparent threat. What began as a scientific curiosity has turned into a visceral restlessness, a threat that forces that escape human comprehension were there, hidden in the darkness, waiting for the moment to reveal themselves. That night would be just the beginning of an experience that would change his view of the natural world forever, leaving him with a constant doubt. What would be living there, in the shadow of the forest, beyond the limits of logic and science? During the night, as Alex tried to calm his nerves after hearing the guttural sound that seemed to echo from within the forest, he realized that something really strange was happening. The lights on his monitoring equipment began to flicker erratically, even though they had been working normally for a few hours. His motion sensors had also gone off several times, but the next morning, when checking the recordings, he found no sign of visible movement. It was as if the forest was playing with him, distorting the very perception of reality. The feeling that there was something there, hidden in the darkness, intensified. Alex began to notice small changes in his own routine, footsteps that seemed to approach him as he walked, but when he stopped to look around, everything went quiet. His dreams became vivid and disturbing, laden with images of tall figures, faceless silhouettes, and eyes that shone in the dim light. The next morning, as he left the camp to investigate further, he noticed that nearby trees had been marked with symbols that looked ancient, perhaps drawings of indigenous people, or something older and more unknown. There was no doubt that this symbol was not common, and its formation seemed deliberate, like a message to anyone who ventured there. The environment around him also began to look different. The trees, once imposing and silent, seemed to rehearse subtle movements, as if they were somehow alive, the leaves moving without wind, creating a constant whisper that seemed more like a response than a simple sensation. A feeling that something was watching him at all times had become almost palpable. Still, Alex tried to rationalize, thinking that it could all be a coincidence, a series of natural events that he didn't fully understand, perhaps the effects of stress or mental fatigue. He knew that in the region there are ancient legends about beings that cross the border between the natural and the supernatural, creatures that native peoples call skinwalkers, who could take various forms and manipulate the minds of their victims. But until then, he had tried to maintain a scientist's demeanor, describing everything as natural phenomena, even when the evidence seemed to point to something far more sinister. As night fell, the silence seemed heavier, almost suffocating. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the tree line, a tall, inhumanly thin silhouette watching him from a distance. His eyes reflected the light of Alex's flashlight, glowing like embers in the darkness. Although his mind wanted to rationalize, his body reacted automatically, going through the reluctance to move away. But the presence remained there, motionless, like a silent warning. What exactly had he found? Was it a manifestation of forces beyond human comprehension, or just an illusion of his tired mind? Consciously, he tried to convince himself that everything was part of a natural phenomenon. But the disconcerting sensations, the mysterious symbols, and that silent figure would make him question reality itself. For Alex, the boundary between the rationale and the supernatural was beginning to blur, leaving a silent neurosis that something strange and ancient was hiding beyond those trees, waiting, observing, ready to reveal itself. With each instant that passed that night, the fear became more oppressive, like a shadow that slowly stretched inside Alex's chest. His senses seemed exacerbated. Every sound, every movement echoed in an amplified way in his mind. The feeling that something outside, somehow supernatural, was lurking gave him overwhelming anxiety. It was as if the forest was trying to communicate, in a way he didn't understand, an ancient and menacing language. His heart pounded, almost wanting to get out of his chest, while his hands sweated cold and his legs trembled involuntarily. He tried to remain calm, remembering the stories he had heard as a child, the indigenous accounts of creatures that can take on human appearances and manipulate the very minds of those who dare to invade his territory. But at that moment, all of it seemed to be becoming real, palpable, a threat that crept into the darkness around him. With each minute, the signs that he was no longer safe increased. Small noises he had previously ignored now felt like heavy footsteps approaching, or perhaps just his imagination playing with him. His body, initially rational in trying to explain what he saw and heard, now reacted instinctively. A sense of panic grew, taking over his mind and almost erasing his logical thoughts. Each breath felt like a struggle against fear. The forest, which had once seemed silent and eternal, had become a space of invisible threats, eyes that lay in the shadows, waiting for the moment to strike. A shiver ran down his spine as he heard a guttural sound once more, closer than before. It was like a roar or a heavy, tired breath, something that could not be explained by natural causes. Anxiety turned into terror, forming a mixture that made it difficult even for her to reason. "What's happening to me?" he thought desperately. "This cannot be happening. It's just my head. It's just a game of the mind." But his intuition said the opposite, that feeling of a real and imminent threat which consumed him inside. He felt a pain in his chest, as if his fear was tightening in his throat, preventing him from breathing normally. Out of the corner of his eye, a shadow passed quickly between the trees, something that seemed almost human, but with a distorted posture, an almost aberrant existence in that ancestral environment. His head was spinning with the possibilities. Was it a manifestation of an ancient force, an entity that lived in those shadows, a creature that fed on the fear of anyone who ventured there? Impotence crushed him. He wanted to run away, run as long as he could, forget what he was seeing. But a paralyzing fear held him back. His muscles felt like gold, motionless, while his mind sank into a spiral of dread. The forest seemed to close in around him as if it was conspiring so that he would never leave that place again. The silence at that moment became worse than any scream, an invisible presence around him, which left dark stains on his perception and strengthened the certainty that he was being hunted by something he could not understand. And there, alone, immobilized by anxiety and fear, Alex felt the gigantic shadow of the forest whisper a silent warning. He would never really be safe in that darkness. The threat, mysterious and overwhelming, had taken root deep in his soul, leaving a mark that he would carry for life. In the dim light of that dark night, Alex realized that the creatures that haunted him were not mere figments of his imagination or ordinary natural phenomena. Something in that forest felt alive, breathing, silently adjusting to his growing fear. As he tried to remain rational, an unsettling feeling that the forces that inhabited this place were adapting to his fear, and actions took hold of him. Pieces of an invisible threat began to reveal themselves slowly, as if a rug was being pulled slowly to show a more terrifying facet of its reality. He felt, in the depths of his soul, that those creatures or supernatural forces were not mere projections, but beings that fed on the vulnerability of their victims. The wind carried distorted sounds, almost like murmurs channeled by some ancient force, which seemed to come from all directions at once. What was once a subtle presence now seemed more audible, more concrete, as if something was adjusting, studying its movements and reactions, like a beast that hunts in a dim light without anyone noticing it until the right moment. As he watched, small changes were happening around him. Trees that seemed to transform in his peripheral vision, shadows that stretched out with barely perceptible movements as if they were made of flesh or non-human matter. Something there had an intelligence of its own, and every step he took seemed to trigger a response from that strange environment which adapted to his emotions, strengthening the feeling that he was being hunted by something he could not define. These supernatural entities did not present themselves in a conventional way. Their existences were mixed with silence, the very essence of the forest. Fleeting scenes, almost like reflections or apparitions, showed glowing eyes hidden among the foliage, observing, analyzing. At times, Alex seemed to hear indecipherable whispers coming from somewhere that had no clear origin, like a sensory labyrinth created by forces that had adapted to his fear. With each moment, the threat became more palpable, more real. A sense that the forest remained alive, conscious, and that its supernatural forces were sometimes hidden, sometimes revealing themselves just enough to show their power. Everything indicated that these forces were aware of his presence, adjusting their strategy so as to involve him more and more deeply in the trap that they themselves created. Without needing a defined form, they adapted to their fear, to their attempts to escape, like an entity that hunts in the shadows, invisible but omnipresent. The very nature of this place seemed to be attuned to impersonal manifestations, distorted sights, indecipherable sounds, a presence that became increasingly threatening. Alex, even with his trained reasoning, could no longer differentiate the real from the supernatural. In every shadow, in every whisper, he could feel that the dark forces there were preparing for the next move, something that might be much closer than he would have liked to imagine, and that his struggle for survival had turned into a battle against the unconscious of a force too old to be overcome with mere courage. As the night progressed, Alex began to experience a sense of disorientation that seemed to grow with each moment. The forest around him, once frightening in its own right, now seemed distorted, as if it had been manipulated by forces beyond his comprehension. The boundaries between what was real and what was the result of an altered perception began to fade, leaving him increasingly confused and out of control. The trees, which had previously seemed to be just silent giants, now seemed to move subtly, their branches elongating and twisting in an almost intentional way. At times, Alex had the impression that the shadows that stretched between the trunks took on a life of their own, forming distorted human figures which silently watched him, adjusting to his fears and vulnerability. His eyes, once trained to distinguish the natural from the supernatural, began to fail. From small changes in vision to illusions that made him doubt his own mind, it all seemed like a joke of some invisible force. Sounds that had once seemed distant now echoed in his head with a disconcerting intensity. Indistinguishable whispers, footsteps that seemed to be beside him, but when he looked, the forest remained motionless, like a silent screen. The very landscape that was there, familiar at first, began to transform before his eyes. A tree that seemed solid turned into a flattened shadow. A rock on the ground seemed to beat like a living heart. The feeling that reality was dissolving, pushing him to the edge of madness, had become immense. Alex tried to hold on to what little rationality was left, but even it began to unravel. In his mind, he began to doubt even what he saw properly. Was that a hallucination created by fear, or a powerful ancient force that manipulated your perception, leaving you confused and insane? Every step he took in the forest seemed like a walk on the border between real and imagined, between the known world and an unknown matter, of ancestral and supernatural origin. The forest seemed to be playing with his mind, causing him to lose track of direction and time. His senses were at war, trying to distinguish what was a real manifestation from what was a projection or hallucination induced by the forces that inhabited it. At every moment, he found himself convinced that the limits of his own mind were being broken, leaving room for a growing sense of powerlessness. The shadowy figures that had previously seemed merely shadows now seemed to have a will of their own, moving with an intention he couldn't understand. The environment, once a simple forest, had become a labyrinth of distorted perceptions, where the real mixed with the illusory, confusing all his sensations and leaving him completely lost in the darkness. His heart was pounding, his thoughts scrambled, as the line between the world he knew and what his perceptions were creating became increasingly blurred, threatening to consume him. Simply, Alex felt that he was going to disappear there, in the shadow of that forest, between what existed and what had become a mirage in his murky mind. Alex knew he couldn't run away any longer. The forest seemed to be closing in around him, and every passage seemed like a trap created by something beyond his comprehension. His mind and body were at war, but he realized he needed to act. The opportunity came when a figure, or what his distorted perception told him was a figure, appeared before him, larger and more menacing than anything he had seen before. His eyes reflected the faint light of the lanterns, now blurred by his own doubt, and his skin seemed to transform, taking on an almost inhuman form, a reflection of what he believed to be a manifestation of ancestral strength typical of that forest. The entity or force, which until then had shown itself to be invisible, now revealed itself with a threatening presence, a kind of hybrid creature, a mixture of human, animal, and something unknown. His movements were slow but relentless, as if he was adjusting his strategy to dominate his mind and body totally. Alex felt a strange fire burning his chest, a mixture of fear, anger, and hopelessness. Their internal struggle was almost stronger than the external threat. He questioned whether it really existed, or if it was an illusion created by his mind. At the same time, he knew that under the influence of that psychological weight, his body could be his enemy. The creature rushed forward, and for a moment he just tried to resist, widening his eyes with all the strength he had. His feet slipped in the mud, but he managed to steady himself, wielding a flashlight as a protective weapon. With a scream that seemed to escape his soul, he rushed toward the shadow, trying to face her, challenging her at last, with all his physical and mental strength. His thoughts were divided between the hope of survival and the fear of being consumed by that entity, which seemed to slowly merge into its surroundings, changing its form into something even more terrifying by the moment. Still, he did not back down. His clenched fists and his voice, despite the fear that choked his throat, cried out in the silence of the forest, "Show yourself! You won't scare me!" It was a desperate action, but one that feigned a bravery that he hadn't felt in hours. In an instant, the creature recoiled as if frightened, retreating into the shadow like a wounded beast, while Alex, panting, tried to understand if this had been a victory or a final illusion. Adrenaline pulsed through his veins as he stared at the threat that had shown itself for a few seconds to be partially vulnerable. The conflict within him was not yet over, for even in the face of the apparent retreat, a sense that it would return, or that an even greater force was lurking in that environment, remained strong. He knew he had faced what seemed to be a concrete manifestation of the supernatural, but the real battle, his internal struggle for sanity and survival, was still far from over. As silence returned to the forest, a smaller shadow lurked in the dim light, watching, as if preparing for an upcoming attack. Alex realized, with a mixture of relief and fear, that the threat had not been completely destroyed, only temporarily removed. And in that moment of vulnerability, the realization that it could all be yet to come consumed him, fueling his greatest conflict: how to disappear from there, or fight against what, until then, seemed an incomprehensible and eternal force. Hiding in the darkness of the unknown, Alex remained motionless for a few minutes, breathing heavily as his hands trembled involuntarily. The creature, which for a brief moment seemed vulnerable, had retreated into the shadows, leaving an eerie silence in the air. But even with that apparent withdrawal, he knew that the real threat was not yet over. His thoughts tried to rationalize what had just happened. He had faced something that his cultural roots and his previous experiences told him was an ancient force, a manifestation of something supernatural that inhabited that forest. As his mind tried to assimilate the battle, he began to reflect on the choices that led him there. Why had he insisted on staying? Why hadn't he retreated immediately, even when the sense of danger was increasing by the moment? The answer came with a mixture of regret and acknowledgement. He had gone there to find answers, to challenge the unknown, but now he realized how reckless he had been. Every decision, every step, seemed to have contributed to his vulnerability. He had allowed himself to be dominated by fear and at the same time nurtured the hope that this could be an illusion. But that night made it clear that the forces that inhabited the forest were not simple illusions or tricks of the mind. The experience had been real, brutal, and terrifying, leaving an invisible scar on his soul. The rhythm of his breathing slowly calmed down, but a sense of uncertainty remained fixed in his heart. What else could inhabit those shadows? How could such an ancient force adapt, hide, and manipulate the perception of someone as rational as him? This doubt hung in the air, like a thick fog, making clear his inability to fully comprehend what he was facing. He looked around, looking for some sign that would confirm that it was really over, but all he saw were quiet trees and absolute pitch. Silence reigned in the forest, cut only by his own racing heart. His mind, still haunted by thoughts of escape, began to reflect on what he had learned. that the threat there was intelligent, adaptable, and perhaps something older than any culture or legend could explain. Still, one question remained unanswered. Would it come back? And if he did, would he be prepared to face again? The feeling of emotional vulnerability was mixed with relief, leaving a trail of doubt. Alex knew he needed to get out of there, preferably as soon as possible, before he wanted a new confrontation. But in her heart, there was also a silent certainty. That night had changed everything. He could no longer simply leave that forest behind as an isolated experience. The threat that resided there had become ingrained in his perception, in his soul, like a shadow that would never completely disappear. And as he tried to gather the strength to leave, one last thing became clear to him. In this place, the real conflict was not yet over. The mystery remained, alive and latent, in the dark gloom of the trees. And no matter how hard he tried to forget, the questions would never cease to haunt his mind. What exactly had he faced? And that, in fact, would never go away. As Alex slowly walked towards the exit of the forest, a lingering sense that something remained hidden in the dark took root in his mind. Despite the momentary relief, he knew that the real combat was not yet over. There are mysteries that remain buried beneath the surface of that ancient forest, secrets that your observations, your dreams, and your own perceptions had not yet been able to fully unravel. Even after their last confrontation, details kept emerging, fragments of a dark truth that refused to reveal itself in full. That entity or force he had faced seemed to be just the tip of an iceberg, a glimpse of a world that had long been adept at hiding in the shade of centuries-old trees. During his escape, he remembered some symbols marked on the trees and certain dark voices that still echoed in his memory. Signs that the presence he faced had roots far deeper and older than any local history or legend could explain. And that night, as the stars shone for a brief moment in the dark sky, he realized that some questions would still haunt him. What exactly were these creatures? Where did they come from? Why did they adapt and manipulate the environment around them with such cunning? And what was the true limit of these supernatural forces that seemed to hide, transform, and adjust to the emotions and fears of those who faced them? Even more disturbing was the fact that, as he deepened his investigation, Alex began to uncover clues and accounts of others, old villagers and hunters, who also had similar experiences, but guarded their secrets for fear of being undermined by their own community. This evidence suggested that the forest had held secrets for generations, fueled by ancient pacts, forgotten myths, and forces that eluded conventional logic. His own dreams, now mixing human figures with deformed beasts and forms that defied rational explanation, reinforced the idea that something ancient and powerful still lay silent, waiting for its next opportunity to show itself. The night he spent there left invisible marks on his soul, and he knew that this mystery would never be fully solved. What he discovered was just one piece of a larger puzzle, a fragment of a dark secret that could only be revealed under circumstances that might never come to fruition. And as he walked toward his car, his entire understanding of the world seemed to turn into a web of uncertainty, doubt, and unanswered questions. Some forces, he thought, were destined to remain hidden, feeding stories and legends that were passed down from generation to generation, never ceasing to frighten those who happened to cross their path. The forest, with all its mystery, kept its secrets in the shadows, and the true face of what resided there might never be fully revealed. The night was over, but the questions would continue to hang in the air, invisible, silent, and eternal, leaving a sense that the real terror was, in essence, the mystery that could never be fully understood. Jacob Miller was 34 years old, and his routine as an investigator of supernatural phenomena led him to explore remote and forgotten areas of the interior of the United States. A resident of a small town in Arizona, Jacob has always been fascinated by stories of indigenous legends, mysterious creatures, and forces that defy human understanding. His greatest passion was investigating accounts of unexplained events in the forest of Oak Creek, a vast area dominated by ancient trees, whose shadow seems to hide secrets that transcend time. The gigantic trees and the tortuous paths created a tense and silent environment, where the wind whispered stories of yesteryear and the sky was rarely seen due to the closed canopy. It was a region surrounded by rumors, legends of skinwalkers, ancestral spirits and creatures that adapt to the shadows, feeding the fear and curiosity of those who dared to enter it. That day, Jacob decided to camp in a secluded clearing south of Oak Creek, prompted by a recent report from locals who claimed to have seen strange lights and heard indecipherable sounds at night. Ever since she had received the complaint, she had felt a mixture of fascination and apprehension, as if she were about to discover something that could put her rationality to the test. As soon as he arrived, silence prevailed, broken only occasionally by his breathing charge or by the rustling of the leaves, which seemed to be in constant motion even without wind. The shadow of the trees grew around him, and the light of the fire began to seem insignificant in the face of the dark expanse that surrounded him. When it got completely dark, a sense of unease set in. Jacob noticed that the natural sounds seemed insufficient, and that the forest seemed to be breathing in a way that was almost synchronized with his heartbeat. Then, to his eyes, a distant light appeared between the trunks, flashing irregularly, like an explorer's lantern or a coordinate of some unknown entity. Driven by curiosity and fear, he decided to investigate, even though he knew that it could be a trap or a powerful manifestation. As he approached, the sounds of light footsteps, of a presence that seemed to dare to play with his mind, began to intensify. His instincts told him that something there was unnatural, that the shadows and lights dancing in the distance hid a threat he could not yet comprehend. The feeling of being watched became stronger, until finally he realized it. It was not just one light, but several, and they seemed to move towards him as if they had a life of their own. A growing concern that his presence there had awakened. Something old, perhaps a force beyond logic, took hold of his mind. And in the silence that hung in the forest, an almost inaudible whisper began to be heard, bringing a feeling that something was approaching, silently, in a threat that had yet to be fully revealed. Jacob realized, with a hint of fear, that tonight would mark the beginning of a mystery that would change his view of the world forever. At dawn, Jacob realized that his first impressions were far from being just the effect of his imagination. Something in that forest looked different, as if the trees themselves were changing shape or position slowly, barely noticeable, but enough to send a shiver down your spine. The birds that had once sung excitedly were silent, the sunlight filtering. Through the canopies appeared darker, almost as if a shadow was seeping through the branches. Jacob tried to rationalize. Perhaps it was the effect of sleep, or his own anxiety exacerbated by the previous difficult night, but as he progressed in his investigation, stranger signs began to emerge. Their normally reliable electronic instruments had unexplained failures. The motion sensors went off several times during the morning, although nothing visible was detected in the recording. And stranger still, when he observed the trees, he had the feeling that some of them seemed to move subtly, as if they were living entities adjusting their positions slowly, trying to interpret their presence. Among the many picturesque images on his cameras, photos taken the night before revealed something that shouldn't be there. Marks on the ground that seemed deep, like claw marks or some unknown biological structure, but completely out of the ordinary in a typical forest. The previously clear sky was beginning to darken, and a fine mist was beginning to spread, enveloping everything in a curtain of mystery. As the day wore on, the feeling that something supernatural was lurking in the forest intensified. Jacob heard, in the silence, whispers that seemed to echo in his head, in addition to the natural noise of the forest. He tried to keep his logic, thinking that perhaps it was the effects of exhaustion or the fixed idea that something unusual was going on. But his hands trembled nervously as he inspected every detail, every shade that seemed darker or elongated. His eyes were fixed on the lines of the trees, trying to distinguish if they were carved by some animal or something older, stranger. Small changes began to occur in the scenes he saw in the cameras, as if they adjusted automatically, shaping a narrative he didn't want to accept. The shadows seemed to come to life, stretching towards him as if trying to get closer. His senses were on edge, and every sound, every movement in the forest seemed charged with a hidden intention. Jacob began to doubt his own reality. Had the forest become conscious? Or was there something there, ancestral and invisible, that was capturing his attention on purpose? The mystery seemed to deepen by the minute, leaving a feeling that it was all just a gateway to something much bigger, something that had not yet been fully revealed. A presence that took possession of the room, quietly waiting for its moment to show itself. And as the sun slowly hid over the horizon, he knew with growing anxiety that this afternoon would mark only the beginning of a dark and frightening truth, one that still had many secrets to reveal. The night seemed to deepen, and with it Jacob's fear became almost palpable. Every sound in the forest seemed to mock his logic, as if nature itself was conspiring to scare him, to show him that he had no control. His muscles tensed, his hands sweated cold, forming small cups on the tool he carried. The tension grew in, his chest like an invisible force, squeezing, suffocating. His eyes were fixed on the shadows that danced among the trees, and with each moment the feeling that he was no longer alone increased. Jacob knew that something was watching, that the shadows around him were moving, even though nothing was visible to the naked eye, and this uncertainty fueled his despair. His thoughts swirled in a spiral of anxiety, trying to make sense of what he saw and heard, but his mind refused to accept the possibility of something supernatural. It was easier to blame his fatigue, the tiredness of intense days, or any rational explanation, though deep down he knew something stranger was going on there. His eyes were looking for signs, any detail that might give him a clue, a tree leaning differently, a sound that might be a silent approach, a shadow that didn't fit into the natural routine of the forest. But everything seemed to be against him, blessed by a restlessness he could not control. A sense of latent threat began to spread, like a presence that slowly surrounded him, hiding in the dim light, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. His heartbeat quickened, as if each beat was a warning that the real danger was already there, close though he couldn't see it. A deep anguish grew, accompanied by a growing impotence, as if he were caught in an invisible trap. He tried to remain calm, but his breath became labored, each exhale charged with fear. Every step he took seemed heavier, every breath harder. His wide eyes scanned the shadows, trying to detect any sign, any movement that would confirm his suspicions. And even so, the doubt persisted. Was that just his imagination, or did something actually lurk in the darkness, waiting to emerge and dominate everything? The forest itself, once a simple clearing with trees, now looked like a living entity, wanting to swallow its presence. His thoughts were embarrassed, and the feeling of vulnerability increased. His mind screamed for an escape, but his body remained immobilized by a deep fear that froze his muscles. Every step, every silence carried an implicit threat, a force that adapted to his emotions, intensifying the feeling that he had no chance of winning. A shadow, darker than the others, passed quickly on his peripheral vision, sending a chill down his spine. Jacob felt his body tremble, his heart nervous pause inside his chest, and an inner voice whispered that this was not an isolated occurrence. It was an ancient presence, an evil that waited in the dim light, ready to act. And as the forest remained silent, his fear became a permanent shadow in his soul, a sense that at any moment that which threatened him could reveal itself, and that all he could do was wait, his heart racing, terrified of what was yet to come. As the night wore on, Jacob began to realize that what he was facing was no ordinary threat. The shadows that once seemed just plays of light and shadow now behaved differently, as if they were living entities adjusting to their surroundings and their emotions. The trees, which seemed motionless, suddenly seemed to retract, or slowly lengthen, as if they were bending to hide something in the darkness. The feeling that the environment itself adapted to his perceptions grew, reinforcing the idea that a supernatural, intelligent, and extremely ancient force was somehow molding itself to his actions and thoughts. Jacob felt a subtle, almost imperceptible, presence seeping into the atmosphere. Distant sounds, a whisper that seemed to come from all sides, an almost inaudible voice, which turned into a kind of song or lament, began to fill the heavy silence of the forest. These sounds were not natural, nor did they seem only like the wind. They were like a communication, an invitation, or a veiled threat, which slowly increased Jacob's anxiety, leaving him with the feeling that something was hiding in the dim, a light waiting for the right moment to show itself. The shadows, once static, began to move more quickly, forming vague figures, perhaps just delusions of his mind, but with an aura of intention. With each moment it became clearer that these supernatural forces were not just random reactions of the forest, but beings that had learned to hide, to transform, to adapt to the fears of those who invaded their territory. Something there seemed to feed on his spirit of fear, strengthening his invisible presence. With each step Jacob took, he felt stronger that the threat was not a fixed manifestation, but an entity that evolved, that transformed itself into his own perception of threat. What seemed like a simple shadow suddenly seemed to take on a more defined form, something that resembled a body, an almost human figure, but with details that escaped comprehension. The more he tried to rationalize the situation, the more the feeling that it was not limited to a simple illusion intensified. The signs, the manifestations, seemed to fit his doubts, as if the forest were alive, with an intelligence of its own, which knew its fears and exploited every weakness. Jacob saw the shadows approaching, silent, like a force that dominated the environment and wanted to be closer and closer, more present. These beings or forces had no definite form, but the threat they conveyed was undeniable, an ancient, fear-feeding presence that somehow seemed able to transform itself to hide in its own light or darkness as it needed to. The more he tried to distinguish the boundary between the natural and the supernatural, the more it became clear that these forces were adjusting to his senses, feeding on his inability to fully comprehend them. The forest, which had once seemed silent, now radiated a latent threat, leaving Jacob with the feeling that the real danger was much closer than anyone could have imagined, and that the truth about those forces still remained hidden in the shadows. He had dared to challenge. As the night progressed, Jacob began to feel his senses becoming more and more confused. Some trees, which only moments ago seemed motionless and solid, now seemed to undulate, as if they were breathing slowly, molding themselves to his vision. His perception of reality began to dilute, as if the forest itself was manipulating itself, distorting everything he saw. The sounds around him, which at first seemed only the whisper of the wind, had turned into indistinct murmurs, almost like a communication sent by some invisible force trying to manipulate his mind. Ear for ear, sound for sound, everything was a mixture of reality and fantasy, and he could no longer distinguish one from the other. When he looked at the trees, it seemed that some of them became taller and more angled, stretching towards him, as if trying to touch him or imprison him in his own mind. The shadows also multiplied, taking on shapes that resembled human figures, monsters, or deformed animals, which disappeared and reappeared in the thick fog. His head was spinning, the images forming and crumbling too quickly for him to comprehend, whether they were real visions or illusions created by his growing fear. His senses, in a kind of internal war, seemed to deceive him, feeding a feeling that everything around him had been altered, manipulating his perception of space, time, and even his own mental resistance. The air around him seemed to become heavier, giving him the feeling that his own environment was an active, shifting, shape-shifting entity, subtly, like an entity with its own consciousness. Each step he took felt like a walk across the threshold of the conscious and the subconscious, where the boundaries between the real and the imagined began to fade. Jacob had the impression that the forest was transforming before his eyes, the trees bending and twisting, the shadows forming figures. That could be his own projections or something more sinister. Even the sky above, which had previously seemed only cloudy, was tinged with colors that made no sense. Dark tones, which blended with the moving of the trees, creating a landscape that looked like a distorted painting made by a force playing with his mind. His thoughts were scrambled, sometimes convinced that it was all a physical manifestation, sometimes doubting his own sanity, as if he were losing control of his perception of the world. It all seemed like an illusion, a trap of his own mind, but at the same time, everything indicated that these visions were more than mere hallucinations. They were echoes of a reality that for some reason had been manipulated, distorted, altered by unknown forces, and as he tried to understand if it was all a joke of his mind or a real manifestation of the forces that inhabited the forest, he felt an even greater doubt. What, after all, was influencing his perception? Was he walking truly or completely wrong? And at that moment, in the dim light of the trees that became shadowy and deformed figures, Jacob realized that his reality would never be the same again, because his understanding of the world and what was real had been irreversibly shaken. The forest seemed to close completely around Jacob, as if his presence was activating an ancient force that did not tolerate invaders. His breathing quickened, heart beating like a war drum in his chest. His eyes fixed on the shadow that formed a few meters from him, aware that the time to face whatever it was had come. He knew somehow that it would not disappear on its own, that his only chance to survive was to confront head-on that entity or force that insisted on showing itself. With trembling but determined hands, Jacob picked up his flashlight beam, which now looked like a weapon of protection against the darkness that was becoming denser than ever. His feet, once hesitant, found enough strength to move forward. As soon as he took the first step, the shadow advanced with frightening speed, blending human and animalistic forms, distorting everything around him. His sharp white teeth gleamed. In the darkness as he approached, a presence that seemed to vibrate with an intelligence of its own, unstoppable. Jacob felt his body react impulsively, a mixture of fear, anger, and a fierce urge to resist. It was a struggle not only against that creature, but against himself, against the ever-increasing doubt and powerlessness. Rational arguments tried to emerge, but they were far removed from the dread that dominated his mind. He shouted in a desperate attempt to challenge the entity, an audible response in the oppressive stillness of the forest. "Show your face! I'm not afraid of you!" The creature, almost as if responding to his challenge, sped up, its blurred forms becoming more defined, as if it was feeding on his courage. The confrontation became intense, an exchange of energy, of a symbolic struggle between Jacob's rationality and the supernatural force that seemed to want to consume everything. In a movement of pure adrenaline, he raised the flashlight and pointed it in the direction of that shadow. A burst of blazing light, a bright flash that cut through the darkness like a dry blow, and for a brief instant the dark form recoiled. The entity, or whatever it was, howled in a way that seemed to be a cry of pain or anger as it slowly dissolved into the dim light. Jacob, breathing hard, felt his body throbbing with exhaustion, but a sense of triumph pulsed in his chest. However, around him the forest remained silent, as if the battle had been unique, a very brief window of confrontation between two opposing forces. Inside him, an even greater struggle chisels his inner conflict. He had faced something real, but he also questioned whether all his perception had not been an illusion, created by his weak and tired mind. The danger had been temporarily averted, but his heart knew that the real combat was not yet over, that this old force might try to return at any moment. Even so, he felt stronger, although he carried in his eyes a fear that would hardly disappear. With heavy steps, slowly, he began to walk away from the clearing, aware that the real battle was not just in that instant, but in his own soul, against the mystery that remained hidden in the darkness. Jacob stood there for a few moments, breathing deeply as his mind tried to process what had just happened. The shadow that had approached him, the threat that seemed to have fed on his fear, had now receded, but a sense of vulnerability remained. He knew that the battle was not over. It had only been momentarily interrupted. His thoughts wandered, reflecting on the choices that had brought him there. Curiosity, the stubbornness to explore the unknown, the desire to understand something his mind was reluctant to accept. With each step he took back to his tent, he felt a mixture of relief and growing uncertainty. If that came back, what would he do? How could he protect his own mind from such ancient and adaptive forces? Still, the struggle had left a mark on him, a quiet determination that, though frustrated, he needed to return to his reality, even though he knew nothing else would be the same. The silence of the forest seemed denser, almost charged with an invisible presence that watched, silent, waiting for its next move. What had once seemed like a horror story now became a memory that insisted on remaining at the door of his mind, a reminder that the mystery he faced there was still secret, hidden among the shadows. As he walked back, the pace of his steps slowed down, but the tension didn't completely disappear. The real threat, or his distorted perception of it, remained hanging in the air. He knew that no matter how hard he tried to rationalize everything, something in that forest had survived his attack, whispering promises of an inevitable return. And with that uncertainty in his heart, Jacob prepared for the next night, knowing that the real conflict might just begun. Jacob walked slowly, each step laden with a bitter mixture of frustration and fascination. His eyes were fixed on the shadows around him, knowing that what he had faced was only a fraction of something much bigger. Even after their confrontation, many secrets remained buried in the darkness of that ancient forest. He was beginning to realize that the answers he was looking for were not simple or predictable. The marks, the voices, and the deformed forms indicated an ancient strength, which adapted, hid, and perhaps even fed on fear. Every detail he examined seemed to open a door to a forgotten history, an ancestral pact, or an entity that stood the test of time. With his mind buzzing with questions, Jacob reflected on his actions. The more he tried to understand, the more the pieces of the puzzle were scattered, as if the forest was hiding something that could never be completely revealed. Still, he had a sense, a deep intuition, that the forces he faced were far from being understood by the limits of his logic. There were still secrets that escaped, details full of symbolism, enigmatic signs etched into the trees, and echoes of voices whispering in his head, asking to be discovered. and what seemed to be a confrontation had been only a superficial face of the mystery. In his dreams, visions of deformed human figures, red eyes and ancestral symbols continued to emerge, fueling a certainty that was hard to ignore. The force that inhabited that forest had a history, a connection to the past that was never fully unraveled. Jacob was aware that if he wanted to survive, he would need to dive deeper into his research, to explore what the ancients believed, what the myths hid. But what he didn't know was that these revelations could be far beyond his comprehension, something that, if discovered, would change his perception of the world forever. The forest, silent and mysterious, seemed to keep its greatest secrets. In the shadows, like a living entity, watching and waiting for the right moment to show itself again. And as he walked toward his exit, one last clue manifested itself. A shadow that moved in the dim light, more defined, more threatening, as if waiting to be discovered. Jacob's subconscious sensed that this was only the beginning, that the true essence of the mystery had not yet been revealed. Behind that ancient forest, there are forces that remain hidden, waiting for their moment to reappear. Perhaps stronger, more cunning, ready to reveal themselves at the moment when you least expect it. And so, with his heart racing, he realized that his journey was not over. The deepest secret was yet to come. Liam Carter was 41 years old and worked as a specialist in indigenous studies and ancestral legends in the state of Utah. Their routine was made up of expeditions into remote territories, arbiters of an investigation that mixed science, history, and often a silent fear of something the ancients called forces from beyond. His passion for unraveling mysteries took him to places where few people would dare, especially in a region surrounded by rugged mountains and dense forests such as Cedar Ridge. The scenery was imposing. Gigantic trees, whose height almost touched the sky, formed a natural ceiling of shadows and silence. The dim light stretched for miles, creating an environment charged with an almost palpable suspense, where the wind carried whispers that seemed to come from ancient times, and each sound seemed loaded with hidden meaning. Ever since he arrived at the camp on the edge of the forest, Liam had felt an uneasiness he couldn't ignore. Their records indicated unusual patterns of activity, as if a presence was watching their actions, studying their reactions. Before he even pitched his tent, he heard a strange noise, like the sound of light footsteps among the trees, even though there was no visible trail. His eyes, trained to pick up subtle cues, noticed shadows moving on the periphery of his vision, as if the forest itself was distorting its structure, letting the trees appear taller, more threatening. With each passing hour, the atmosphere became more difficult to bear. The heavy silence seemed to deepen, almost as if the environment was waiting for something. Liam tried to rationalize. Maybe it was just the effect of isolation, or the sound of the wind, or some creature in the woods. But his heart was racing differently. The air felt heavier, and at times he had the feeling that he was not alone, as if unseen forces beyond human comprehension are adjusting to your present, preparing for something greater. And it was in this climate of tension that he noticed a subtle change in the forest itself. The trees seemed to be more still, but their shadows, sometimes almost human, suddenly seemed to move more deliberately. Trinkets and objects he brought with him seemed to be touched by an energy that escaped his logic. Then, on a night of almost deafening silence, Liam was overcome by a sensation that froze him, a presence he could not define, something that transcends any known creature. He looked in the direction of the trees and saw, almost like an entity, or a shape that hid between the trunks, as if he was just there waiting for the right moment to emerge. The threat, hitherto subtle, was beginning to creep in more clearly. An ancient force, perhaps, that still remained hidden in the forest, observing, studying. Liam began to understand that what he thought was just a legend could actually be alive there in the shadow of ancient nature. And as the night deepened, the whispers grew louder, making it clear that the mystery of that forest was greater than he could have ever imagined. As the night wore on, Liam began to realize that things were no longer the same. The familiar sounds of the forest became higher-pitched, distorted, almost as if something was manipulating the very essence of that environment. The trees, which had seemed motionless moments before, seemed to move slowly, their shadows lengthening and writhing unsettlingly in the dim light. His trained eyes, accustomed to detecting subtle details, picked up on a change in the atmosphere itself, a dampness charged with an inexplicable energy, a sense that the space around him was bending, changing its proportions and structure. Liam tried to convince himself that it was the effect of tiredness, isolation, or even fear growing in his chest. Perhaps it was just the imagination fed by his studies of ancient legends. But inside, he felt a growing restlessness, as if unseen. Forces were adjusting to his emotional state. His senses, which were supposed to help him survive, seemed to be being deceived. The wind seemed to carry indecisive whispers, and his own breathing became heavier, almost as if he were fighting, a force that wanted to silence his perception. Then something more disturbing began to emerge, small signs that the presence around him had adapted to his actions. The trees seemed to light up in a more faint way, almost as if they were expecting something. His steps, which had previously been firm, became hesitant as the sense of a silent threat settled in his mind. Moments of calm, almost absolute silence, were interrupted by sighs or small noises, like falling objects or a leaf that seemed to move without wind. Liam tried to rationalize these signs. Perhaps they were just natural events, or the result of his own anxiety. But he couldn't deny the strange weight in the atmosphere, as if the environment itself were alive, watching, waiting for the right moment to reveal its secret. He made his way slowly, each step more tense than the last, as his eyes scanned every shadow around. Each sound took on a more sinister dimension. Each movement seemed loaded with intention. Deep down, he was aware that he did not know the true mystery that surrounded him. An ancient force which slowly adapted to his fear, perhaps even feeding on it. The silhouettes of the trees, once mere shadows, now seemed more defined, ready to reveal themselves. The forest, which seemed silent, had become a presence full of secrets, almost wanting to say something, but leaving everything dark, mysterious, an invitation for him to lose himself in his own doubt. And so, as the heavy silence deepened, Liam inevitably felt that the real threat was just beginning to unfold, hidden in the dim light, waiting for his next move. Liam's heart was beating fast and uncontrolled, each breath becoming more difficult with the weight of anxiety rising within him. A sense of dread had set in, heavy, almost suffocating, as if an invisible force were silently approaching, watching every movement, every breath. His body trembled involuntarily, and the doubt about what really threatened him began to devour his mind. He felt that something much greater than his comprehension, an ancestral presence, perhaps a force from beyond, was manifesting, taking advantage of his growing fear. Every step he took seemed heavier, every sound more charged with a threat. His brain couldn't name. In the moments of silence, the silence became more deafening, as if the environment itself was holding its breath, waiting to reveal itself. Liam tried to convince himself that it could all be a figment of his imagination, his own mind playing tricks, fueled by loneliness and fear of the unknown. But inside, he knew it was different. The signs were all too real. Trees that seemed to bend slightly, shadows that moved in his peripheral vision, whispers that seemed to echo from within the land itself. An icy sensation ran down his spine as he realized that his senses were no longer under his control. His thoughts, which should have helped him reason, were now scrambled in a mixture of fear, doubt, and helplessness. At every moment, he had the impression that the threat was strengthening, adjusting to his emotional state as if it were playing with him, feeding on his despair. The fear of being hunted, of being deceived by forces that transcended his understanding, corroded his courage. For a moment, he saw a shadow darker than the others, which seemed to move towards him like a beast in silence. His mind screamed for an escape, to escape from that suffocating sensation. But his body remained paralyzed, dominated by a force that seemed to want to extinguish all hope. His muscles, once strong, were now heavy, as if intoxication or weakness had taken over. His extremities. The environment became a reflection of his own anguish. Invisible walls of fear that surrounded him, human shadows that emerged and faded in the dim light, giving the impression that everything in this place was alive, conscious, and that danger is something that adapts and evolves. The few dominant emotions were fear and despair, growing by the second, while Liam realized that no matter how hard he tried to rationalize, what he faced seemed more like a force that reveals itself in his vulnerability. A force that played with his thoughts, his perceptions, and ultimately his own sanity. And in the heavy silence that surrounded him, only one certainty remained for him. The real danger would transcend his understanding. Perhaps what seemed to be the final threat was actually a manifestation of something much older, hidden in the very essence of the forest and the invisible world that he had not yet dared to understand. As the night deepened, Liam realized that what he faced was no ordinary threat. The shadows around him seemed to move of their own accord, adjusting their forms in the dim light in an almost clever way. The trees, which had seemed motionless moments before, began to wriggle slowly, their silhouettes elongating and deforming, as if they were alive, adapting to his perceptions and the fear that grew within him. A subtle, almost imperceptible vibration began to spread through the air, an invisible force that seemed to mold itself to the environment, increasing the feeling that it was more than just a natural manifestation. His senses, previously trained to detect subtle signals, now played tricks on him, distorting the scenario and fueling the doubt that what he saw was just an illusion. But the signs were clear. Shadows that moved slowly, as if adjusting to their emotions. The whispers that once seemed to echo from everywhere now became more defined, almost like a conversation that the forces of the forest were having with him, with intentions he could not understand. Every step he took seemed to accelerate the presence of these forces that adapted to his actions, almost like an ancient chess game in which he was just a piece. Liam began to realize that the creatures or forces surrounding him had an inhuman ability to hide and transform. Its contours could be anything: a shadow, a deformed figure, a shape that seemed to change according to his fear. Perhaps they could take on the appearance of anything around them, fragmenting the very notion of reality. What seemed like a smaller presence slowly strengthened, taking on more defined shapes as it approached, without him being able to detect exactly when or where they would begin to act. The threat, initially subtle, intensified at every moment, as if the forest itself was filling with an ancient and hidden intelligence, fed by secrets long buried. Liam felt that the environment around him was no longer a simple forest, but an invisible battlefield where supernatural forces adjusted, testing their reactions, ready to emerge at the right time. There was no longer any possibility of ignoring. Those forces learned from him, molding themselves to his emotions, to his vulnerability. The shadows lengthened. The figures became clearer in their blurred visions, and behind the veil of night, Liam realized that the forest itself was a living entity, adapting to his fear, hiding in the dim light, and waiting for the moment to reveal itself. The more I tried to understand, the more the mystery grew, a threat that fed on human emotions, that changed and hid in the darkness like an ancient, untouchable force. The feeling that all this might just be beginning settled deep in his chest, making it clear that the real danger was something that adapted, camouflaged and grew silently, hidden in the shadows that surrounded his journey. As Liam advanced through the dark forest, a feeling of confusion began to wash over him. His senses, once sharpened, now seemed to deceive his own perception. The trees, which seemed firm and imposing, began to distort in his vision as if they were slowly extending or shrinking, creating a feeling that the surrounding environment was expanding and shrinking irregularly. Each step he took seemed to lead somewhere different, as if the boundaries of space were moving, playing with his sense of reality. The sounds were also becoming more and more ambiguous. The singing of birds, which had once been clear, now seemed farther away or closer, sometimes an indistinct murmur, other times like a muffled cry coming from all directions. Liam began to doubt what his ears were telling him, as if he were hearing echoes of a world that no longer really existed. His eyes tried to focus on the shadows and shapes around him, but everything seemed to transform in front of him, as if the trees were moving slowly to create deformed figures or to hide something in the darkness. The shadows, which had previously been quiet, seemed to take on a life of their own, lengthening or receding in sync with their confused perception. His mind, caught in uncertainty, tried desperately to distinguish the real from the imagined. But it was as if the forest itself was playing with him, manipulating his consciousness so that it could not distinguish what was true. Every sound, every figure seemed to transform. Now a shadow that seemed to approach him, now a vision that disappeared at the speed of a sigh, leaving him more disoriented. The setting seemed to change continuously, creating a labyrinth of contradictory sensations. Liam felt a mixture of fear and growing doubt, as if his emotions were fueling the very changes in his environment. He no longer knew if it was an illusion of his tired mind or a manifestation of forces that were clearly beyond his comprehension. His eyes, accustomed to searching for details, could now only capture shapes that dissolved when he focused on them, reinforcing the idea that his perception had been corrupted. The forest seemed to bend and distort according to his thoughts, reflecting his anxiety and fear. The more he tried to rationalize, the more everything around him became confused, as if the landscape itself had become an illusion, a lie carefully crafted by dark forces that fed on his vulnerability. The fine line between what was real and what was a projection of his mind seemed to have completely disappeared. Liam found himself lost in a world where reality itself was fragmented, and each step seemed more like an inglorious attempt to grab something that was really there, even though he knew that maybe it was all just an illusion created by forces that still remained hidden. At that moment, he understood that his perception had been totally distorted, and that the real threat lay not only in the darkness of the forest, but in the very fragility of the human mind in the face of the unknown. The tension reached its peak when Liam, surrounded by shadows that seemed to take shape, realized that he could no longer run away. His muscles were tense, and panic was a tight mass deep in his chest. As the frightening presence approached, I moved forward with a biting silence, his eyes fixed on a figure that was outlined in the dim light, a silhouette that mixed the human and the animal, with eyes that shone like embers in the darkness. Without thinking, Liam raised his flashlight, his only weapon against what seemed like an ancient and cunning force. There was no room for doubt or hesitation. Their survival depended on desperate action. He shouted in a measured effort to challenge it, even though he knew that he might be facing a force far beyond his comprehension. "Show your face. I'm not afraid of you." The creature retreated for a moment as if struck by that scream, but its presence remained, immense and threatening. Then in an adrenaline rush, Liam charged toward the shadow, pointing the beam of light in hopes of blinding it, of splitting its strength. The confrontation turned into a wild dance of light and shadow, where every move had the weight of his life. The entity or force transformed before his eyes, a mixture of forms, an abomination that fed on fear and that seemed to adapt to Liam's attempts at attack, almost as if he were playing a game of survival. With brute force and a courage that seemed to have escaped his own body, Liam launched himself towards the shadow. His clenched fists slammed lightly against an unseen force, while his voice screamed a last attempt to challenge the unseen. "I'm not going to be your toy. You won't take me." The creature or force, something that transcended all logic, seemed to falter for a brief instant. A burst of light emanated from her beam, and the shadow tightened, as if it was being hit by a force. She couldn't resist. A torrent of ancient energy was released, causing the entire forest to tremble at impact. Then, for a brief moment, the threat receded, almost like a wounded animal, preparing for one last charge. Liam, panting, knew that he had faced a real force, something that was not just an illusion. His inner struggle was also demonstrated in his physical and mental endurance, for as the shadow retreated, he struggled with fear, the desire to survive, and the doubt whether he had been strong enough to truly conquer it. But even with the threat momentarily gone, Liam felt a presence still latent in the air, as if the environment itself was whispering that the real danger was not gone yet. It was just hiding in the darkness. The confrontation was over for now, but the war for survival and the understanding of what he was really up against was far from over. He knew that this moment would only be the beginning of an even darker journey, in which mystery and the supernatural intertwine, ready to reappear in the silent darkness of the forest. Liam stood there panting for some time, as the force or shadow he had faced slowly receded into darkness. Despite having managed to take a momentary break, a persistent sense of vulnerability settled deep within him. His thoughts began to wander, reflecting on each decision that had led him to that moment. The courage he had, the arrogance of venturing into the forest, and now the weight of knowing that something far beyond the natural still remained there, hidden in the darkness. His mind tried to process what had just happened, but everything seemed horribly muddy. The images of the fight, the shadow momentarily defeated, still hovered in his memory, diffusing a mixture of relief and fear. He knew that even though that battle was over for now, its emotional and psychological impact was still profound. The very forest around him seemed never the same again. The trees that had once seemed motionless now seemed to silently await the next move. He felt an uncomfortable sense that what he had faced was not a passing threat, but a force that could reappear at any moment, adapting even more to his actions. His breathing was still rapid, but he tried to calm down as he scanned the environment around him, looking for signs that it was all really over. Still, a doubt filled his thoughts. Had he been strong enough? Or would that force, which seemed to always be one step ahead, come back with more intensity? Uncertainty slowly consumed him, creating a feeling that everything could change at any moment. Even with the momentary relief, his head reiterated that the real confrontation, the one that would shape his destiny, was yet to come. He felt small in the face of forces that transcended his comprehension, and this awareness increased his vulnerability. As she slowly walked back to camp, each step seemed laden with an invisible weight, as if her own environment was whispering that her journey still had many mysteries to uncover. The sounds of the wind, which once seemed only natural, now seemed to be loaded with cryptic and threatening messages. This slow deceleration in tension brought no relief, but a sense that the final battle, or at least a new phase of it, was yet to come. Liam looked one last time at the dark sky, where stars dotted the silent vastness, and wondered, how far would that go? How long would it take to really understand what's hidden here? He knew that his fight, though momentarily paused, was not over. The forest held its darkest secrets in the shadows, and as he walked toward his car, the uncertainty of what was to come next hung in the heavy air. That eerie silence was, in fact, an invitation for him to come back, to explore more, to face what was still hidden. And so, with fear working internally, Liam realized that the real battle was still a matter of time. Liam walked slowly, each step carrying the weight of everything he had faced in the darkness of the forest. Although he had managed to momentarily ward off the threat that was stalking him, an unsettling feeling remained. He intuited that what he had discovered was only a small part of something much larger, hidden in the deep shadows of that ancient environment. The shadows lengthened. The figures became clearer in their blurred visions, and behind the veil of night, Liam realized that the forest itself was a living entity, adapting to his fear, hiding in the dim light, and waiting for the moment to reveal itself. The more I tried to understand, the more the mystery grew, a threat that fed on human emotions, that changed and hid in the darkness like an ancient, untouchable force. The feeling that all this might just be beginning settled deep in his chest, making it clear that the real danger was something that adapted, camouflaged, and grew silently, hidden in the shadows that surrounded his journey. As Liam advanced through the dark forest, a feeling of confusion began to wash over him. His senses, once sharpened, now seemed to deceive his own perception. The trees, which seemed firm and imposing, began to distort in his vision as if they were slowly extending or shrinking, creating a feeling that the surrounding environment was expanding and shrinking irregularly. Each step he took seemed to lead somewhere different, as if the boundaries of space were moving, playing with his sense of reality. The sounds were also becoming more and more ambiguous. The singing of birds, which had once been clear, now seemed farther away or closer, sometimes an indistinct murmur, other times like a muffled cry coming from all directions. Liam began to doubt what his ears were telling him, as if he were hearing echoes of a world that no longer really existed. His eyes tried to focus on the shadows and shapes around him, but everything seemed to transform in front of him, as if the trees were moving slowly to create deformed figures or to hide something in the darkness. The shadows, which had previously been quiet, seemed to take on a life of their own, lengthening or receding in sync with their confused perception. His mind, caught in uncertainty, tried desperately to distinguish the real from the imagined. But it was as if the forest itself was playing with him, manipulating his consciousness so that it could not distinguish what was true. Every sound, every figure seemed to transform. Now a shadow that seemed to approach him, now a vision that disappeared at the speed of a sigh, leaving him more disoriented. The setting seemed to change continuously, creating a labyrinth of contradictory sensations. Liam felt a mixture of fear and growing doubt, as if his emotions were fueling the very changes in his environment. He no longer knew if it was an illusion of his tired mind or a manifestation of forces that were clearly beyond his comprehension. His eyes, accustomed to searching for details, could now only capture shapes that dissolved when he focused on them, reinforcing the idea that his perception had been corrupted. The forest seemed to bend and distort according to his thoughts, reflecting his anxiety and fear. The more he tried to rationalize, the more everything around him became confused, as if the landscape itself had become an illusion, a lie carefully crafted by dark forces that fed on his vulnerability. The fine line between what was real and what was a projection of his mind seemed to have completely disappeared. Liam found himself lost in a world where reality itself was fragmented, and each step seemed more like an inglorious attempt to grab something that was really there, even though he knew that maybe it was all just an illusion created by forces that still remained hidden. At that moment, He understood that his perception had been totally distorted, and that the real threat lay, not only in the darkness of the forest, but in the very fragility of the human mind in the face of the unknown. The tension reached its peak when Liam, surrounded by shadows that seemed to take shape, realized that he could no longer run away. His muscles were tense, and panic was a tight mass deep in his chest. As the frightening presence approached, I moved forward with a biting silence, his eyes fixed on a figure that was outlined in the dim light, a silhouette that mixed the human and the animal, with eyes that shone like embers in the darkness. Without thinking, Liam raised his flashlight, his only weapon against what seemed like an ancient and cunning force. There was no room for doubt or hesitation. Their survival depended on desperate action. He shouted in a measured effort to challenge it, even though he knew that he might be facing a force far beyond his comprehension. "Show your face. I'm not afraid of you." The creature retreated for a moment as if struck by that scream, but its presence remained, immense and threatening. Then in an adrenaline rush, Liam charged toward the shadow, pointing the beam of light in hopes of blinding it, of splitting its strength. The confrontation turned into a wild dance of light and shadow, where every move had the weight of his life. The entity or force transformed before his eyes, a mixture of forms, an abomination that fed on fear and that seemed to adapt to Liam's attempts at attack, almost as if he were playing a game of survival. With brute force and a courage that seemed to have escaped his own body, Liam launched himself towards the shadow. His clenched fists slammed lightly against an unseen force, while his voice screamed a last attempt to challenge the unseen. "I'm not going to be your toy. You won't take me." The creature or force, something that transcended all logic, seemed to falter for a brief instant. A burst of light emanated from her beam, and the shadow tightened, as if it was being hit by a force. She couldn't resist. A torrent of ancient energy was released, causing the entire forest to tremble at impact. Then for a brief moment, the threat receded, almost like a wounded animal, preparing for one last charge. Liam, panting, knew that he had faced a real force, something that was not just an illusion. His inner struggle was also demonstrated in his physical and mental endurance, for as the shadow retreated, he struggled with fear, the desire to survive, and the doubt whether he had been strong enough to truly conquer it. But even with the threat momentarily gone, Liam felt a presence still latent in the air, as if the environment itself was whispering that the real danger was not gone yet. It was just hiding in the darkness. The confrontation was over for now, but the war for survival and the understanding of what he was really up against was far from over. He knew that this moment would only be the beginning of an even darker journey, in which mystery and the supernatural intertwine, ready to reappear in the silent darkness of the forest. Liam stood there panting for some time, as the force or shadow he had faced slowly receded into darkness. Despite having managed to take a momentary break, a persistent sense of vulnerability settled deep within him. His thoughts began to wander, reflecting on each decision that had led him to that moment. The courage he had, the arrogance of venturing into the forest, and now the weight of knowing that something far beyond the natural still remained there, hidden in the darkness. His mind tried to process what had just happened, but everything seemed horribly muddy. The images of the fight, the shadow momentarily defeated, still hovered in his memory, diffusing a mixture of relief and fear. He knew that even though that battle was over for now, its emotional and psychological impact was still profound. The very forest around him seemed never the same again. The trees that had once seemed motionless now seemed to silently await the next move. He felt an uncomfortable sense that what he had faced was not a passing threat, but a force that could reappear at any moment, adapting even more to his actions. His breathing was still rapid, but he tried to calm down as he scanned the environment around him. looking for signs that it was all really over. Still, a doubt filled his thoughts. Had he been strong enough? Or would that force, which seemed to always be one step ahead, come back with more intensity? Uncertainty slowly consumed him, creating a feeling that everything could change at any moment. Even with the momentary relief, his head reiterated that the real confrontation, the one that would shape his destiny, was yet to come. He felt small in the face of forces that transcended his comprehension, and this awareness increased his vulnerability. As she slowly walked back to camp, each step seemed laden with an invisible weight, as if her own environment was whispering that her journey still had many mysteries to uncover. The sounds of the wind, which once seemed only natural, now seemed to be loaded with cryptic and threatening messages. This slow deceleration in tension brought no relief, but a sense that the final battle, or at least a new phase of it, was yet to come. Liam looked one last time at the dark sky, where stars dotted the silent vastness, and wondered, how far would that go? How long would it take to really understand what's hidden here? He knew that his fight, though momentarily paused, was not over. The forest held its darkest secrets in the shadows, and as he walked toward his car, the uncertainty of what was to come next hung in the heavy air. That eerie silence was, in fact, an invitation for him to come back, to explore more, to face what was still hidden. And so, with fear working internally, Liam realized that the real battle was still a matter of time. Liam walked slowly, each step carrying the weight of everything he had faced in the darkness of the forest. Although he had managed to momentarily ward off the threat that was stalking him, an unsettling feeling remained. He intuited that what he had discovered was only a small part of something much larger, hidden in the deep shadows of that ancient environment. Ethan looked around, his eyes looking for something that might reassure him, but all he saw were trees that bowed silently in the wind, shadows that seemed laden with a subtext he would never have the courage to fully understand. The forest, which seemed to divide different worlds, now seemed like a great mirror of what he had become, vulnerable, scared, and deeply sorry for everything he had discovered. Perhaps, deep down, he knew that this confrontation was not enough to destroy all the strength that had nourished him for ages. Perhaps the old forces had only taken the time to hide, waiting for an opportunity to return, stronger, more patient. A force that, as much as it seemed defeated, had never ceased to exist. It just hid in the thin line between space and time, in the memory that no one else dared to remember, in the darkness that silently expanded in the collective memory. Ethan felt the absence of answers as an unbearable burden. With each step he took away from that forest, the sense of emptiness within him grew, as if he were leaving parts of himself there, in the shadow of ancient curses and pacts made by hands that were now also his. An inheritance he could not deny. But at the same time a small spark of hope remained, fragile but persistent. Perhaps in that eternal silence, some force was still fighting for a chance to start over, to manifest itself once more, to conquer what had long been its silent territory. Perhaps what he had faced so far was only a prelude, a sample of what he really awakened back in the distant past, when old hands made pacts that should not have been made. And now, even after the chaos, the darkness seemed even more alive, a presence that refused to be forgotten, that waited on the border between sleep and wakefulness, ready to reveal itself again. Ethan knew that the forces that haunted him on his darkest nights were just waiting for their moment to return. He realized, unequivocally, that what he thought was a victory was an illusion of someone who had not yet seen what really dwelt in the deepest shadow of the world. And so, with a heavy heart and a restless mind, he decided to say goodbye to that space, at least for now. But even as he left, a doubt persisted. a doubt that could not be erased. How far could it go? How long would it be before the irreconcilable and past returned stronger than ever? And most of all, what would be the price of all this if the old beings, with their pacts and curses, really chose to re-emerge from their own darkness? Some questions remain unanswered. A shadow that projects beyond human comprehension, a threat that never actually dies, just falls asleep, waiting for its moment to return. Ethel walked away, leaving behind the trees that seemed to whisper ancient secrets, forgotten by time, but never fully buried. Deep in his soul, a silent certainty was established. Terror was a constant on the border between worlds, a force that feeds on fear, silence, the vulnerability of those who dare to look beyond the curtain of normal life. And with that memory, Ethan felt that there was only one thing to do: to remain attentive and prepared, because even if everyone thought they had won, the truth was that this fight had never ceased to exist. She just slept like a sleeping beast, but ready to awaken at any moment. And when that happened, nothing and no one could guarantee that its end would be a victory or a new beginning. It would only be known when the next cycle began, and the oldest, darkest and quietest forces rose again on the border between the worlds, leaving a trail of doubt and fear for that which was never fully revealed. Ethan looked once more into the dark forest, and a chill down his spine went through him, because in those trees and shadows there was something that still remained alive, something that never promised to disappear, and that was perhaps just waiting for the exact time to return. And in that eternal wait, Ethan also knew that the real horror was yet to come. Because on the border between the worlds, the past never dies. He just waits for his next opportunity to manifest himself. If you enjoyed this story and want to stay on top of more incredible supernatural adventures, don't waste time. Subscribe to the channel, activate the bell so you don't miss any new videos, and be part of this community that lives on the border between the real and the impossible. Here, we explore the darkest mysteries and share stories that will make your skin cold. So let's go. Click now, come with us on this journey, and let's find out what else the world hides in the shadows.